Welcome to this webinar. My name is Nicola Bock. I'm Head of Events at Agora Energiewende. In today's webinar, we'd like to present the findings of a recent report, which is called The Perfect Fit, Shaping the Fit for 55 Package to Drive a Climate-Compatible Heat Pump Market. And the report has in fact already been published at the end of March. And it's the result of a collaborative effort between the Regulatory Assistance Project, REP, Agora Energiewende, CLASP for Efficient Appliances for People and the Planet, and the Global Buildings Performance Network, GBPN. And actually, from the 9 authors that were writing on that report, we today have 4 on the podium. 2 will be presenting the report and 2 will be moderating the webinar. So we can actually expect firsthand insights. And as usually, we've also invited a number of stakeholders to give their views on the report and also will be there for a discussion later on. But now I'd like to ask Andreas Graf to switch on his camera. He's my colleague from the EU, or our Brussels team. He's Senior Associate EU Energy Policy and also one of the authors. And he'll start with the moderation. And I hand over the microphone to you. The floor is yours, Andreas.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you for opening this event. It's my great pleasure to welcome the 2 first speakers and to introduce the presenters of this report before I hand off in the second half of the event to Jan Rosenau, who from the Regulatory Assistance Project, who will be moderating a panel discussion following up on the presentation. So if I may ask first Richard Lowe's to join us. He's Senior Associate at the Regulatory Assistance Project, RAP, based in the UK, and brings more than 10 years of experience in the heating sector from industry, academia, and policy, and has served or currently serves in advisory roles for the Scottish, Irish, and UK governments, and brings a wealth of experience and was lead author on this report. And if I may also ask Marie Batten, Europe lead at CLASP, to join us. She is an expert in international product standards and works at CLASP, an organization that works on energy access through product standards and efficiency through product standards, and brings a wealth of experience also, and is a co-author of this report. So I hand over to you, Richard, to introduce the report.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Let me just share my screen. Hope everyone can see that okay now. So as Nicola introduced, this was a collaborative report between a number of organisations, including RAP, Agora, CLASP, GBPN, and we were supported by the Crux Alliance. And the Crux Alliance looks to support cross-sector and cross-institution policy work in clean energy. I'll be starting the presentation and I'll hand over to Marie halfway through, and then it will pass back to me. So the reason for the focus of the report really has changed significantly since we started, it's worth saying. The climate benefits of heat pumps have been recognised for years, although more recently, of course, the security benefits of heat pumps have been recognised. And so really the context of the report changed as we were writing it. So an overview of my presentation today, and Marie as well, will focus on the importance of heat pumps, why heat pumps are so important for European energy policy, policy principles to deliver heat pumps, the impact of the Fit for 55 package, and proposed changes for how the Fit for 55 package could be reformed to further support heat pumps. And that's something that's now increasingly important as the REPower EU proposals have been published. And finally, because of the time of EU legislative change, we'll also be thinking about what member states can do now. But just for context, it's really important to remember that the vast majority of heat in the EU still comes from fossil fuels. And while there has been huge progress on renewables, fossil fuel heating dominates. Primarily this is gas, but there's also some coal and oil in the mix. And renewables are only responsible for a relatively small share of the heating, a share which has to grow significantly to meet the various goals, including zero carbon targets too. It's also worth noting briefly that while we have much district heating in the EU, lots of this is also powered by fossil fuels, and so that needs to also move towards renewable sources. Central to both building level heat decarbonisation and heat network decarbonisation are heat pumps. This has been shown now in various reports and publications. This graph, which we use in the report, paints that picture, I guess, most clearly and most dramatically. And so this is from the McKinsey Net Zero Europe study, and it shows that heat pumps need to grow from a relatively low level now to become the dominant heat technology by 2050 to become a net zero continent. Similarly, but perhaps more dramatically, analysis for the European Commission, and this was the analysis behind the impact assessment for the EPBD reform, for the Energy Efficiency Directive reform, shows that across all of the scenarios that were considered, heat pumps are expected to grow rapidly. And I think the most striking thing about this graph is that actually this growth in heat pumps was expected to happen not really in the 2030s or 2040s, although it does still grow, but earlier than that, in the 2020s. And that gives perspective to the need for really rapid change around heating. It doesn't really matter what the scenarios are on the right-hand side. There are various ones that were considered, but all of them, which included a higher proportion of low carbon gas, for example, or a higher proportion of biomass, still showed this dramatic growth in heat pumps in the very near term. Coming back to Repower EU, it's also become quite clear that heat pumps are a key tool for reducing gas demand. And that's because the majority of energy that is produced or comes out of a heat pump is extracted from the environment, and that energy can be replaced or is replaced naturally. And so clearly, if that heat's no longer coming from gas and other fossil fuels, that will reduce the demand for fossil fuels, and therefore heat pumps are a very key tool for removing gas. The Repower EU proposals considered doubling the Fit for 55 package heat pump deployment rates from where they were, as I showed previously. So that dramatic growth is now expected to be even more dramatic. And this isn't from our report, but this is some analysis that was done by some colleagues at RAP and other organizations, which looked at how Russian gas imports could be stopped as quickly as possible. And clearly the Fit for 55 package would have some impact there, but actually further moves on energy efficiency and also heat pumps could have significant benefits in terms of gas demand reductions. So onto the policy. What currently holds back the deployment of heat pumps at mass levels? Well, there are three key items that we considered specifically in our report. First of all, and very importantly, is the economics of heat pumps. Heat pumps suffer from higher upfront costs than fossil fuel heating equivalents. And while some of those costs are associated with the actual transformation of a building to be suitable for a heat pump and to use lower flow temperatures, it's unlikely in the short term, and possibly even the medium term, that heat pumps will reach the same price as a gas boiler install, although some companies are looking to change that. So first of all, with the economics, there is the issue of higher capital costs for installing a heat pump. The second economic issue for heat pumps is around the price balances between electricity and gas. Now, this varies between countries. In some countries, currently, it's cheaper to run a heat pump than it is to run a gas boiler, but that's not always the case. And so the combination of these factors shifts the economics often away from heat pumps towards fossil fuel heating. Secondly, there's the existing policy environment. For many years, countries have been actively supporting fossil fuel heating, and that includes through the expansion of gas grids, direct subsidies for fossil fuel heating, energy efficiency standards, and so on. And so for some perspectives, gas heating and fossil fuel heating has a social license to act. It's still given support by policymakers, sometimes even direct subsidy for fuels. And finally, the third key element that affects heat pump deployment is the existing incumbent infrastructure. And this is primarily network infrastructure, and more often than not, gas grids, though not necessarily. It could also be the infrastructure associated with oil heating, which is of course different. But this infrastructure doesn't just have a sunk cost, it also has an element of technological familiarity. People are used to, for example, having a gas boiler and having the instantaneous heat it provides. People may also be used to having the high temperatures that oil heating can offer. But what the image on the right-hand side shows is that this doesn't need to be the case everywhere. And a number of countries across Europe, and particularly in the Nordic region, have seen significant heat pump deployment already. The leader, the king of heat pumps, as we have it in this diagram, is Norway. But Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, and Estonia are all doing very well because of a history of supportive policy environments. Other member states looking to do much more, such as France, aren't doing so well, and we haven't included the UK on this map, but if the UK were to be included, that would be 1. And I should have explained what this graph shows is the number of heat pumps installed per 100 households. So overall, when we looked at the policy for heat pumps and what a supportive environment looked like, it's clear that no single policy will be able to deliver heat pumps at this scale and at the speed needed for the various decarbonisation goals, and also for the new goals under Repower EU, which we expect to hear more about shortly, of course. So 3 things need to be in place to support heat pumps rapidly and to support them well and successfully. First of all, financial support is needed, and that's the triangle at the bottom there. That needs to include things like finance, so finance for households and building owners, so that you can have cash available to make these changes if necessary, but also could be something as simple as grants. Subsidies are available in a number of countries across Europe, often in combination with loans. So first of all, financial support needs to be there. Second, structural incentives need to be in place. And all this means is that the overall economic environment needs to be supportive for heat pumps. We're never going to reach a level of mass deployment where the life cycle costs of a gas boiler is lower than a heat pump. We need to make sure that heat pumps are naturally the lowest option. And there are various economic levers that can be used to do this, some of which we'll come back to. And finally, very importantly, although perhaps very obviously, the use of regulatory levers is very, very important. And this can be as simple as a ban on a type of appliance or a particular percentage of renewable heat coming from a certain type of appliance or similar. But regulation is likely to be very, very important and has played an important role in countries which have incentivized the use of heat pumps in existing buildings, but very importantly in countries where the use of heat pumps in new buildings is now mandated. That's often through regulation. Finally, something is needed to tie all of these 3 elements together. And this is the dark blue rectangle at the bottom of this graph. And there needs to be strong governance here. This won't deliver itself. It needs coordination. It needs coordination around quality of installations, skills, protection for consumers, needs for planning requirements, which heat pumps often suffer from, innovation to make heat pumps even better than they are now, and financing. And that refers to wider financing issues, such as requirements for mortgage providers or central banks, for example. Together, once all of those reforms and policies are in place, it's very likely that there will be rapid and significant deployment of heat pumps. But the important thing to remember is that one of them won't be enough, and they all need to happen together. Okay, and now I'll pass over to Marie. Thanks, Marie.
Thank you, Richard. So yes, as you mentioned, everything needs to happen together. So let's look at what is in the proposed Fit for 55 package as it stands now. So we're starting with a couple of instruments that would have an impact on the price, on the financial aspect that Richard just mentioned. So that would be the emission trading system, take 2, and the energy taxation directive. Both would have an impact to support the deployment of heat pumps through having an impact on the relative prices of fossil fuel energies versus electricity and decarbonized electricity. A couple of questions remain open, such as whether the emission trading system will be adopted also for buildings, whether buildings will be covered, whether that is going to be maintained or not. And for the energy taxation directive, it needs to be adopted. The unanimity is needed for this kind of reforms. So that also remains to be seen whether it is adopted. There are a couple of concerns in how those would be implemented and the consequences, namely for the emission trading system. a too high price of carbon would have a negative impact on the sustainability of the scheme and on the most vulnerable consumers. So for that, sort of a price cap or a price channel corridor could be put in place, and that would be supported by by strengthening the requirements for the effort sharing regulation and through the energy efficiency directive by increasing also the targets under this directive. So that would help limit the increase of carbon by putting pressure on the member states to put in place measures. Also, some mechanisms could be put in place to channel the revenues of those schemes towards the most vulnerable consumers, which would also mitigate the impact on those and further support the development of heat pumps. I think that would be it. If you want to go to the next slide. Thank you. Then continuing on the Renewable Energy Directive and the Energy Efficiency Directive, both see their targets increased under the new proposals. That would be, for the Energy Efficiency Directive, let's say both the final and primary energy targets, energy saving targets increase. They could increase further. And besides that, some of the concerns we have around the definition of, the use of biomass and what is defined as efficient heating and cooling, and which could count in reaching the targets. One thing to highlight that directly concerns heat pumps is that under the Energy Efficiency Directive, the support from member states to shift to more efficient heating system based on fossil fuels would no longer be allowed to count as savings. So that would be in favor of the development of heat pumps. But yeah, mostly the concerns are around the treatment of bioenergy and the definitions of what counts as efficient heating and cooling, and on the level of the saving targets, and that could be higher. And next, thank you. Under the directive for the energy performance of buildings, there would be requirements for new buildings and buildings undergoing or units undergoing deep retrofits, and on the other side for the existing stock. For new buildings and deep retrofits, the requirement would be to reach zero emissions by 2030. For the existing buildings, the national building innovation plans need to set out policies to phase out the fossil fuel by 2040. So that is a progress. We're just concerned that those should happen earlier to avoid a lock-in effect of those buildings into fossil fuel, into heating systems that rely purely on fossil fuels. Also, some other requirements are put in place concerning the buildings below Class E that after 2033 are requested to move to a minimum of Class E, but that would not be enough to rely on low temperature heating system. So there is also concern on the ambition of the requirements for those retrofits, lighter retrofits. Yes, I'm checking how I'm doing on time. Yes, thank you. Concerning labeling and eco-design, so both how the efficiency that is presented to the consumers and the type of equipments that are simply allowed on the European market, the proposed rescale for, the proposed revision for the energy labeling directive for heating systems is the scale that you can see on the graphic here. That would mean that even the most efficient condensing boilers, but purely boilers relying on fossil fuels, would achieve a maximum efficiency of class F. And to go above the class F, it would need to be, for example, hybrid boilers that could make it, or heat pumps, or solar supported. And so the energy label is that their proposed revision has a clear difference with the existing. However, on the eco-design side, the proposal does not move towards a ban of fossil fuel boilers. For now, it just increases slightly the efficiency of each type, but without initiating a ban of fossil fuel. I should also say that, yes, on the label, a marking of the hydrogen-ready boilers is expected to be requested for those aesthetic concerns. There is a concern that it might confuse consumers for those aesthetic concerns. To better support the deployment of heat pumps, we suggest that the minimum efficiency requirement to be enforced as early as practically possible, given the time of adoption of and implementation of the regulation, should be of 110% efficiency, seasonal efficiency. And that would, I suppose, more or less correspond to what the Netherlands, I think, just put in place. So that brings us nicely to the next slide on what member states can do. So because, yeah, this package, those measures would be put in place at the European level. Obviously, member states remain free to move faster or stronger with some of their own policies. They can have an impact on the pricing. They can change the balance of the price of electricity versus gas and fossil fuel energies. They can put in place subsidies or like green loans for consumers that want to invest in heat pumps for the first time, for example. And they can move forward with banning fossil fuel based equipment, just not on the basis of efficiency, because they would be covered by eco-design, but on the basis of greenhouse gas emissions or type of fuel that would be allowed. So I think that was it for me. Yes, we have the example of Germany moving forward, and just very recently announced the Netherlands also moving towards this direction. Thank you. And Richard, I'm leaving the mic to you for the conclusions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Marie. That's a great overview. And I think you had the hardest task there to cover all of the different parts of the directives. I think it's worth pointing out just in conclusion that the economics of heat pumps and energy efficiency in buildings in general has flipped since the change and the crisis to gas prices. And we're also seeing incredible innovation in heat pumps with performance increasing. But in general, the centrality of heat pumps for heat decarbonisation and energy security is increasingly recognised. And of course, we saw the German discussions last week regarding the move for non-boiler-only installations of heating systems from 2024. And we've seen a similar announcement from the Netherlands today regarding the installation of systems after 2026, which will have to be at least hybrid systems. So every new heating system in the Netherlands after 2026 will have to have at least part heat pump. And it will be very interesting to see whether that does deliver hybrids or whether that just delivers pure heat pumps. But alongside those sorts of bans and targets, it's clear that packages of policies and measures are needed. And you can't simply use a ban, although they probably are very useful tools. But you also need to ensure that your pricing is fixed and that heat pumps are cheaper to run, and that for households, and in particular households and building owners who are the most vulnerable and the most struggling to pay, that financial support is available. We think overall we're optimistic about the Fit 55 proposals for heat pumps. they will, as they were published, or they would as they were published, have supported a strong heat pump market. Who knows exactly how they will end up in terms of legislation. But overall, we were optimistic when we wrote the report. There is clearly good stuff in there that will drive what is this vital market. But we did identify multiple places where further acceleration and further reform of policy is needed, in particular around mandating appliances in new homes earlier, in tightening up energy efficiency standards and rules, and also through pricing. And of course, the discussions over the ETS2 and its extension to households are very live. That was expected to be a key policy element in terms of pricing, and we're unsure now what will happen with that, of course. And then the Energy Taxation Directive, which also was proposing significant reforms which would support heat pumps, requires unanimous support from member states. And we're, of course, unsure what will happen with that as well. But of course, that doesn't stop member states doing any of this stuff now. And I think it's really important to note that the struggles over EU level policy in the Fit for 55 package and the Repower EU package will go on, and they'll take some time to conclude. But member states can, of course, move early and do much of the things that we've talked about already. So I'd like to thank Marie and really thank all of the co-authors and reviewers I worked with over the course of writing the paper. And I'll hand back to Andreas now. Thanks, Andreas.
Thank you very much, Richard and Marie, for this great overview of the study. So we have 2 questions in so far, and we have about 10 minutes to field questions from the audience before I will hand over again to Jan Rosenau for the panel discussion following this presentation. You can still ask and pose questions via the Q&A function in the bottom or top of your screen. So to begin, there was more of a comment here about the graphic we showed showing the different elements that would be needed for a robust policy mix to drive heat pump deployment. And one observation was that we hadn't really mentioned apprenticeship and schooling of craftsmen who need to install the heat pumps. But Richard, I know this is something you think a lot about, so maybe you can comment a little bit about the role of governments or other actors in driving training of skilled craftsmen in this field.
Thank you, Andreas. It's a really great comment or question, and yeah, indeed something I've thought about very much. In my opinion, actually, the policy to support this is relatively straightforward. I don't think heat policy is a very difficult thing to get right. The biggest bottleneck I think we're likely to face as a continent or as countries is the availability of skilled installers. It will vary significantly between countries. So I'm currently in the UK, where we already have a shortage of plumbers, and we have high levels of wage inflation and high levels of employment. And so there's a general concern over the availability of tradespeople to do not just heat pumps, but also energy efficiency work as well. I'm sorry it didn't come across clear enough. It is considered in that graphic under the governance section. So we have considered it, although perhaps it should be bigger. And it's absolutely something that governments need to think about. And it's twofold as well. It's not just about retraining existing installers, because actually heat pumps do take longer to install than a normal gas boiler. And so by most of the numbers I've seen, it's about twice as long, so twice as many person hours per heat pump, which if you keep your appliance turnover rate at the same rate, that means you need double the amount of installers. And I'm not aware of any country looking to do that right now. But that is something that should be done. And so the existing installer base needs to be retrained. And that's not particularly difficult because it's really the practical skills that are the most difficult bit to learn, the welding of pipes and the sorting out of radiators and underfloor heating. But also to increase the number of people in the system, there needs to be government campaigns in every member state really to encourage people into the sector, but also to provide financial support for students or young people to get into this early, because there's also a time delay. And so if you're a 15-year-old now and you want to become a plumber or a heating engineer, it's going to take you the best part of 2 years before you're probably, well, a year in a classroom for sure. And then it will take you a couple of years to become competent to work on your own. And so it's as well as being not the most popular job to go into, although it is a good job and it's well paid, it takes some time to get there. So there are huge issues. I'm not sure that I've solved them, but it absolutely is something that government should be thinking about.
Thank you. And we have several questions coming in, some that I think should be reserved potentially for the panel. There is one here, however, about the role of the public and private financial sectors in helping to accelerate and upscale the installation of heat pumps, especially regarding the large amounts of funds available through the EU recovery package. So Richard, Marie, do you have any comments on what role you see for financial actors or governments now in providing financial packages for scaling heat pumps using EU funds, for example?
Marie's not unmuted, so maybe Marie, if you want to add anything after I make some suggestions. I think every country needs to have a KfW, a German-style investment bank that allows people to make changes to their house. And that should be, basically via cheap loans, and it should be easy, and it should be state-led, I think, because history has shown us that the private sector, in terms of finance, often wants high rates of interest for these sorts of things. I think that there's no reason why this can't be a priority for investment funds and recovery funds. In fact, we've already seen Italy with its eco bonus policy offering tax rebates of 110%. So effectively giving people cash to install heat pumps and do energy efficiency work. So I think there's a huge role there. In terms of investment, we are seeing companies looking to move very quickly. And I'd note a couple of recent announcements, one from Wiesmann about I think it was, we can't go as fast as possible. We can't go any faster on heat pumps. We need to go as fast as we can, and there's nothing is too fast, I think was what they said basically. And also Octopus Energy in the UK, who are trying to rapidly basically convert the relatively bespoke heat pump installation practice at the moment into a mass market model. And so there is private money available, but I do think there's, from a household perspective, a very important role for government funding, and that I expect would be combinations of loans, but also grants and subsidies, depending on household requirements.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say we have a few good examples, and you mentioned Italy, and I think we're going to look a bit deeper into some of the best practices very soon. And yeah, I was thinking, listening to you, maybe also besides the subsidy for the investment itself, maybe accompanying households into the transition would be something that the authorities would increasingly put in place. That may help too.
So I am wary of time, but also looking at some of the questions that are coming in right now that are perhaps rather best reserved for our panel. In part, they're addressing things that were not covered by the report. So at this point, I would already close the Q&A section for the report presentation. Thank you so much, Richard and Marie, for your great overview. And I would now ask Jan to join us here. And Jan Rosenau is Principal and Director of the European Programs at Regulatory Assistance Project, and has many years of experience also serving on various boards and in different advisory roles, including for the IEA, on issues of demand response and efficiency, and a variety of different issues closely linked to heat pumps. And I now hand off to him to chair this distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Andreas, and thanks, Richard and Marie, for the presentation. We have three panelists today who should provide very interesting insights into this topic. And please do switch on your cameras. So first up, Thomas Novak has just switched on his camera. He represents the European Heat Pump Association, is the Secretary General. We then have Verle Belertz from the European heating industry, here providing an industry perspective. And then finally, Kallis Goldstein, who is working with the cabinet, working directly with Kadri Simpson. So he's at the heart of the Fit for 55 package and the Repower EU process. I want to do sort of two things. First, I wanted to ask the panelists for a brief 3-minute statement on what they've heard, on their perspective on decarbonizing heating and heat pumps. And then I have a couple of questions for each. Let's see how far we get. We want to make sure we will finish on time. But I want to allow you now to give your statements. And I want to go in order of first starting with Werle, then Khalees, and then Thomas. So Werle, please, if you could tell us in 3 minutes what you would want to share with the audience about heat pumps and decarbonizing heating more generally.
Thank you, Jan. So indeed, I mean, as we all know, in the current climate and energy crisis, we need to decarbonize our economy, including heating, because it takes a big share of energy consumption in Europe, and we have to do it at a very unprecedented speed. To ensure that we have a stable and resilient energy system, because I think this is what we all would like to have in the end, with an affordable cost, we will need to rely on more than only electricity. Also, we need to remind ourselves that the building stock and the financial capabilities of the EU citizens are extremely diverse, and therefore we still believe, as European heating industry, that we need a range of heating technologies and energy carriers to support the decarbonization of heating. This is also supported by the different EU modeling pathways towards 2050, where none of those modeling pathways go to a 100% electrification. And hence, our industry is working hardly to meet the goals and to ensure that our heating appliances are that heating appliances are available for all EU citizens that are able to work with renewable energy carriers. What do I mean with renewable energy carriers? Well, that could be renewable electricity, but also, for example, renewable gas to complement the electricity part. That being said, it's very clear that heat pump technologies will play a key role in the decarbonization pathway towards 2050. I'm referring explicitly to heat pump technologies because we do not believe that heat pump technologies are electric heat pumps only. There are more technologies that are considered as heat pumps, including hybrid heat pumps and thermally driven heat pumps. These heat pumps are efficient and can be an excellent solution in some applications. I will give you a very specific example of a hybrid system. So a hybrid heat pump could accelerate the take-up of heat pump technologies because they can be installed in non or not well insulated houses. At a later stage, when the owner decides to insulate the house, the boiler part of the heat pump, the hybrid heat pump can reduce its working and the efficiency increases. However, as mentioned, also in the report of CLASP, but also in our own EHI paper, which we published in 2021 in October, if I remember correctly, on the rolling out of heat pumps and barriers and how to overcome them. There are certain barriers that need to be overcome to massively deploy heat pump technologies. And it's clear that we will have to work together across sectors, also with policymakers to overcome these barriers. That's it from my side, Jan.
Thank you, Werle, and thanks for sticking to time as well. Khalees, if you could go next, that would be great. And then Thomas, thank you.
Of course, with pleasure. Good to be here. Greetings to all this afternoon. Well, on the heat pumps, of course, you know that there is now policy going in the direction of supporting them. It was part of the Repower EU communication back in March. But heat pumps have been part of the decarbonization of the heating system for a long time already. I would suggest that, in my experience, they have only increased in importance, which doesn't mean that we would have reached the end point in this. It's rather a work in progress, as things often tend to be. And there remains a lot to be done, like we heard in the first presentation. Notably on making sure that the regulation is there in terms of ETS, PPD requirements, accelerating the industrial cluster possibly for heat pumps, looking at the eco-design requirements, the rescaling of classes for appliances. But that's not only that. I mentioned that Thomas may want to bring his perspectives in the regulation as well. We have, for example, the F-gas regulation in place that operates the greenhouse gas and global warming potential requirements for heat pumps. So it's a long list of regulations that's already there. Now, what the European Commission can do is give certainty to the markets, encourage investment into decarbonization broadly, of course, in a technologically neutral way, but we know already that, especially in the context of phasing out urgently natural gas, we're looking at hydronic heat pumps as a possible solution to quickly plug in a different energy carrier into the water carrier systems, like in radiators. There is no silver bullet, of course. Verle very kindly mentioned the role of heat pumps in less efficient buildings and how they could work together with a gas boiler or in a hybrid setup. Indeed, that is one way to go. There are also possible modalities into on-site solar PV, renewables, electricity storage or storage of energy as thermal over some period of time. And of course, the building automation control and building management to make sure that there is affordable and sufficient amount of electricity available for the heat pumps, and that we don't end up with blackouts because of increased energy demand. So system approach is what I would like to advocate, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Carlis, for your statement. You've all stuck to time, which is great. I now have a question for each of you on Repower EU, and for those on the call, I assume you all know that tomorrow is a big day when the Commission will launch its Repower EU strategy. I don't know exactly when it will come out, but at some point tomorrow. And everybody is waiting for that, of course. And this was constructed in response mainly to the invasion of Ukraine and the supply side constraints in terms of fossil fuel imports from Russia, but also the rising energy prices, which are, of course, related. So maybe I start with you, Thomas. I mean, you represent the heat pump industry in Europe, and you've looked at various proposals over the last weeks, and I'm interested in hearing from you what your hopes are. You know, when you get the document tomorrow in your inbox, what sort of things would you really like to see in there, and what's your expectation?
Yes, thank you, Jan. And if you allow me, I will give you a bit of background beforehand, so that I can also put my expectation into perspective. We are standing in a situation where we have 2.1 million, nearly 2.2 million heat pumps sold in 2021. So I dare say that we have something like a silver bullet. Even though if you check carefully, the silver bullet is actually used to kill these zombies and things like that. And so that's probably not what it works for. But I think that if we consider heat pumps and hybrid heat pumps, so the combination, as Verle mentioned, of electric heat pumps and gas and other solutions, then we can deploy them in all buildings that we know of. And that's actually something that is quite uncontested. And heat pumps work in residential and commercial and industrial applications, as well as in district heating. So I also want to make sure that we have these solutions for pretty much all the application areas where we need heating. They have been recognized for their benefits now, and what I find is noteworthy that they do work in renovation, especially when you consider them also in combination with renovation activities, but also in a direct boiler replacement in a hybrid system. Since it was mentioned, they do not break the electric grids. We have asked the experts last year, we asked EDSO and the major utilities, and they say the electric grids have been in constant flux over the last decades, and they will continue to do so. What is needed is technology clarity. So it's really needed to say that we are going to electrify heating in the most efficient manner, and this will happen with heat pumps either directly or in hybrid solutions, and that means that you have to update the electric grids. I would also claim that if we have electrification of transport, then heat pumps will eat the breadcrumbs of that electrification effort, because most people will want to be able to charge their car at home, and then a heat pump is actually filling in the gaps for and provides even better stability to the electric grid via load shedding and demand side flexibility. But this demand side flexibility will have to be given a value. And that's something that is outside REPower EU. That's actually something that we should have done a long time ago. We have an electricity market design directive that is not implemented in many member states. So what I would ask the Commission, I'm not asking CLASP that, but I would ask the Commission in general to look at the implementation of this piece of legislation, because that will actually open the opportunity for new business models. What I would like to see in REPower EU is technology clarity. The ambition level that we have seen in the communication was already very good. The drafts that I have seen show that it's not built upon. And I will not ask Carlos to comment on that, because of course none of this is public yet. But if we could give a list of requirements, then this technology clarity is one, and then front loading of many of the pieces of legislations that were mentioned would be very good. We have a list of 18 recommendations that we have actually sent to the Commission, so I can tick off boxes tomorrow and see what has been picked up and what has not been picked up. Thank you for so far.
Thank you, Thomas. And Verle, I have the same question for you. Of course, you represent more than just the heat pump manufacturers. You present the entire heating industry in Europe, covering much wider remit, also including, for example, boiler manufacturers. What are your hopes and expectations? I mean, Thomas was saying we need technology clarity. You made a comment earlier saying that we need to have a variety of technological solutions. They all need to be supported. So what do you hope to see to get out of the REPower EU proposal that we see tomorrow?
Thank you, Jan. So yes, indeed, we go for a multi-technology, multi-energy carrier approach. So we have a bit of a different view than EHPA on this. But what we would like is that all heat pump technologies, so electric heat pumps, hybrid heat pumps, and thermally driven heat pumps are recognized as heat pumps and treated the same way. That is number one. I'm going to give you top 3 of our bullets of what we would like in the REPower EU, because the list is quite long if I would keep on talking. Number 2 would be that we would like renewable gases for heating to be recognized as a solution to complement the electrification part. The heating industry is ready to take on board renewable gases, so we can quickly create a market for renewable gases if we use the heating industry. And then finally, specifically for the heat pumps, we would like to have a favorable framework for heat pump technologies that do not pose a barrier on their further rollout. And here I'm particularly thinking of a combination of the ongoing review of the F-gas regulation with a potential future restriction on chemicals, on PFASs, which would be a threat to heat pumps, since for some applications there would no longer be any refrigerants available in the current market. So please, take into account, if you have to roll out heat pumps, and we will ensure that the policy framework is favorable for it. That's it. Thank you,
Verle. And Thomas already said, Kalis, you can't tell us what's in the document. Of course, we all want to know, but we have to be patient until we see it tomorrow. And I don't want to rely on a leaked document. So I'm really looking forward to seeing it. So the question I'm going to ask you is not what's in the document, but the question is more forward-looking. So once you have published the REPower EU strategy, of course, we have another winter. That's not that long away. October, the heating season is starting again. What is the Commission sort of doing sort of between now and the next winter specifically to reduce our exposure when it comes to gas consumption in heating in particular? And what sort of next steps do you envisage? I mean, this could be broader than just heat pumps. I know that you also have a campaign in the works that has been published already together with the IEA, but what sort of concrete steps do you envisage you will be taking?
Sure. The big picture is, of course, ensuring the security of supply. That's the A and B of the entire how to manage the situation. The second important point is making sure that it happens in an affordable way. And the third, which very closely interlinks to the previous, is that it happens in a predictable way as well. But of course, we don't want to tick off our partners and possible energy providers, telling them that we need certain volumes and how much they can charge us for them because we don't have alternatives. That's not the intention of the transparency. It's rather the point of making people aware of what they can do, should do, and what are the options out there. So starting from the top in the Repower EU, the mindset is to, first of all, make sure that those who are unable to switch, they still have access to energy. Their houses won't go warm, their lights will stay on. So this is, of course, a priority for the winter. The second question is then for those who are able to switch because there's sufficient funds available, because they have made the necessary preparations, is that they take the step. And some member states have committed the Recovery and Resilience funds. There are some ongoing renovation projects from EU structural funds. Those are usually the pipelines that are already out there, that we then allow member states to top up, first of all, with their own resources, but secondly, we also give them advice. So this is the sort of administrative support that we give the member states to make sure that they make use of the possibilities there. So, for example, we know member states have started shifting away from simple grants into building renovation retrofit in favor of loans. Might sound harsh, but the idea is that there's a need to reach more and more houses, more and more households, and to make a business case for the switch. And the current energy prices definitely send the message in the same direction. And then finally, and Jan, you briefly mentioned this, is the behavioral aspect, the energy savings, which is something that we're indeed working together, not just with the IEA, but also with the member states, with the industry, with municipalities. I can't speak on behalf of the mayors quite yet, but I can signal that towards the end of this week, there will be a collaborative energy savings sprint announced by the Covenant of Mayors in collaboration with the European Commission to precisely make the contingency plans, dialogue with citizens, and make sure that on the behavioral front, there is an impact and a dent to energy consumption.
Is anybody speaking, or is the sound clear?
I mean, I can hear you, Thomas. But
I can hear you too.
Jan may be froze.
Yeah, I guess.
I'm here, but you were getting very robotic, Kallis. Maybe that's my connection. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Were you at the end of your point, Kallis?
I'm happy to summarize at the moment, yes.
Okay. I have one more question for each, and then we can go into the Q&A from the audience. I know Thomas wants to talk about heat recovery and things like that, and we come to that, don't worry. But my first question is for Verle. I mean, we've seen in recent months several companies in the heating sector, like Viessmann, for example, most recently, but also Valent, making some pretty bold announcements about new investments in new heat pump manufacturing capacity in various countries in Europe. And of course, there's lots of research underway in all sorts of technologies, not just heat pumps. So from your perspective, how do you see the industry kind of changing and innovating in light of this huge challenge? I mean, going back to Richard's first slide, I think it was, with the graphic showing that the majority of fuels currently used in heating is fossil fuels, is fossil gas, but also oil. And the destination is clearly a very different one. It's one where we use no more fossil fuels. So what sort of transition do you envisage for the industry, and what challenges do you encounter? I mean, this isn't going to be easy, given that we've relied on fossil fuel heating for a very long time. So I'm interested in hearing kind of your perspective on that.
Thank you, Jan. Yes, of course, but our members have been working on technological solutions to decarbonize the heating sectors for years now. And of course, those technologies include technologies that work with renewable gases, meaning, and they are ready today. So these appliances are ready to be deployed. But of course, our members also represent 75% of the hydronic heat pump market in the EU. So they're also working on heat pump technologies, including electric heat pumps, hybrids, and thermally driven heat pumps. And of course, I mean, in recent years, the market was a bit slow to take up these technologies, but now we're seeing the market picking up, and hence the statements, of course, of some of our manufacturers that they are ready to ramp up production. And indeed, amongst all our members, we are all working to increasing our production capacity here in the EU, so we can locally meet the demand rather than having to import appliances from abroad. At the same time, we are also working on overcoming some of the barriers that we identified, including the issue with installers. Although we do not have a direct impact on how installers can learn, we are trying to get more involved, trying to understand how we can support them in taking up some training programs and so on. But we're also working on the technology itself to make them less noisy, because some people complain about that, but also thinking of integrated solutions that take a little bit less space, so they can be installed in, let's say, apartment buildings where there's no space for tanks, or where there are space limitations in general. So we are working on different fronts. So we're developing technologies, we're making sure they are capable of working with all renewable energy carriers. So we're making sure that the technologies are available, and we're trying to focus now on a sort of moving train, unsure where it's heading. I mean, there is a clear direction that we will have to deploy heat pumps, but where the other technologies are heading is a bit unclear now. But we are ready, and we will be working on ramping up what is necessary to meet the demand.
Thank you, Vela. That sounds very encouraging, and I'm sure you will see lots more announcements in the coming months, especially given the recent announcements we've seen in the Netherlands and Germany, for example, which were mentioned previously by Richard and Marie. Actually, this is a nice segue to the question I wanted to ask Khalees. Vela, you mentioned also the installers. We talked a lot about the industry, manufacturing, the technology, but of course, none of this will work if we do not have sufficient numbers of well-trained installers and installers who know what they're doing. Quality of the installation system is good. Khalees, this is probably somewhat tangential to what's in the REPower EU package and in the Fit for 55 package, but the question about skills is so important. I hope you can still hear me. My connection seems to be rather unstable. You can. So my question is, Khalees, what is the Commission doing to help upskilling Europe's workforce to make it fit for the clean heating transition?
I think the question was clear, and let me just repeat this just in case. The question was, what is the European Commission doing to ensure that there are enough skills and that upskilling happens for the green transition? So on this, I'd say it's a structural issue, of course, because people tend to go for different labor offerings rather than engineering and installation. Not that it wouldn't be well paid, but it's rather a question of the focus and maybe public perception. So there is a lot that needs to be done by the member states, by the education authorities, and to a certain extent by the sector to build the prestige. I mean, I think it's absolutely there. And in our strategic documents, we have previously spoken about gender balancing, bringing young people into the sector. So basically diversifying the labor force there, because young people do not necessarily take up heat pump installation or other European green tasks automatically, which I think is slightly an issue. What we're doing, there are a number of initiatives like the European Skills Pact and a number of initiatives, but plus then from the European Institute of Technology, there is a cluster working currently on batteries, but also considering expanding into other related European Green Deal skills segments, which I think is a good initiative, but they need partners on the ground across the EU to actually teach and implement the curricula, because it's a teachers project, so to say. So you need the people on the ground to take it up, to use the method. And that's not always straightforward. So the message is quite clearly there, but there's significant work that can be done by the industries, in that sense that if people know that they have good incomes and stable jobs guaranteed, and possibly some training by the industry, that makes the process just so that much quicker compared to teaching ninth grade kids about physics and the Green Deal and expecting them to end up in the industry 10 to 15 years later, which is simply the time frame we don't have. But I think that there are some good examples out there, and especially companies upskilling and reskilling the labor force directly, and that's the fastest way.
Thank you, Kalisz. Thomas, final question that I prepared, and then we go to the Q&A. And this is about how we price different energy carriers. I know the EHB have released a report a few months back about carbon pricing, I think it was, and the amongst other things, the reform of the European emissions trading system, which might get extended to the building sector. And Richard kind of pointed to this area as one of the areas that would need policy reform. But from your perspective as a heat pump industry representative, what sort of changes do you want to see in terms of how we tax energy, what sort of pricing we apply to encourage the uptake of heat pumps?
Yeah, what we need to do is we need to make the environmentally most beneficial solution the economically most attractive one. And since it is mentioned ever so often that heat pumps are too expensive, and when will you reduce the price, and when will it be as cheap as a gas boiler? Let me just say it very clear. The gas boiler of today is not the cost of a gas boiler today is not reflecting the cost that this gas boiler creates for society. We are having individually affordable heating where society generously pays the cost, and that needs to change. And if you apply a CO2 price on the current fossil gas use, then you will see immediately that the investment cost and the total cost of ownership, they align, and then you have pretty much a similar cost for the end user. So actually, it's not cheaper to have fossil gas. It's just cheaper for the end user, and it's more expensive to society. And I think that should be reflected in the general discussion. So from our perspective, ETS2 would be great. We have heard yesterday that the ENVI committee voted against an extension to the building sector, so we cannot expect that. That would put a burden on the effort sharing mechanism, because somebody will have to pay for these measures. And if you say we want to have additional requirements on renewables, for example, as Germany is doing it, 65%, this is something that can only be met by a very efficient heat pump and a very well-designed system that includes some gas, or it does what you also suggest, this change of recognizing green electricity. That could help, but it will be a challenge, and this challenge will require some investment. And let me bridge this to what Carlos said. What should we do immediately? And I think the immediate thing that people could do is do the 55-degree test. go down in your basement, check your gas boiler setting, and limit the temperature, the flow temperature to the radiators or to your floor heating to 55 degrees. If this gives you comfort on a cold day, you will not only save 6 to 8% of heating costs pretty much immediately because your gas consumption will go down, but you have also tested whether this is a heat pump ready building. And that will allow you to then talk to your installer. But then you will be disappointed because apart from these 2.1 million heat pumps that we have sold as industry last year, now the demand is so big that probably if you come with the idea of replacing your fossil boiler with a heat pump now, you will not get anything before winter, because on the one hand, demand is high. On the other hand, the supply situation is difficult. The heat pump industry is global, and I agree to what Verle said. We are producing a lot of the products here in Europe, but the components are not all done here. And especially semiconductors are really in short supply. So again, here the Commission has done a chips survey, and we have mentioned in this that they should take into consideration that semiconductors are not only used for cars and tablets and phones, but also for other products. So that needs to be taken into consideration. And then when it comes to installer training, I dare say that we do not have a shortage of installers altogether, but we have a shortage of heat pump installers. And I learned this morning that in Germany, 900,000 heating systems are installed every year. From 50,000, 900,000 are installed from 50,000 installer companies. That means 18 per installer company per year. I dare say that this leaves some opportunity. And what we can say is that if you are an installer, you can be trained in about a week to be a heat pump installer, and that needs focus.
Thank you, Thomas. So now I go to the Q&A, and some of the questions are very specific and some of them are quite broad. So I'm going to try to get a mix. We can't probably go through all of them. The first question is for CLASP, and it's a specific one. And this is about whether there will be any specific EU funding for heat decarbonization that won't have to be repaid, especially for sort of social institutions like hospitals, but I guess also schools, other public buildings, whether there would be anything specific that the EU Commission can set up that doesn't require member state engagement.
Well, we are doing projects like Horizon projects that do straight, let's say, implementation and testing of rolling out solutions. That would be one that's direct financing. But let's not forget that energy as such, energy mix, is a member state's competence still, according to real law. And a lot in the segment even goes down to buildings design, urban planning, and the network planning in the municipality. So due to the different levels of administration, you know very well, it wouldn't be appropriate to intervene in that in a large scale. But for those who are takers, yes, there are project grants. And then further to that, of course, the usual structural funds, Next Generation EU budget, and the latest Recovery and Resilience Fund resources, those are available to projects at a national level.
Thank you, CLASP. And now I have a hard question for Verle, just to give you the heads up. And you probably know what this will be about. You mentioned renewable gases a few times in your responses. And the question that is asked is about the relative efficiency, of making renewable gases such as green hydrogen and using it for heating compared to heat pumps. And the person who asked the question is interested in how those big differences in efficiency could ever be neglected in the discussion to the extent that you would prefer renewable gases. That is, it's because you need 6 times more generation capacity for electricity, et cetera, et cetera. That's sort of what the question is about. So big question, and not one you can easily answer in only a couple of minutes, but interested in your view from a heating industry perspective on that.
Okay. First of all, I would like to say that we do not necessarily prefer gases over electricity. We prefer a multi-energy carrier approach. So we prefer all energy carriers to be used in a good way, so we have a resilient energy system. And I think, I mean, it is clear, definitely, that the role of gas will reduce over time. I mean, that's something I think we can all agree with. When we look at the EU modeling, we can still see that there is some amount of gas available for heating in 2050. So there is some amount there available. I think the reasons could be, for example, that heating is something seasonal, meaning that in winter we need much more than in summertime. So to cover, the bump, we might produce less electricity to cover some amount of the electricity needed for heating, and the other amount will be covered by, for example, gas. That's a possibility, or that's a certain explanation of what could happen and why we would still use some gas in some cases. There are other explanations as well, but I will keep it at this for now. And then I would like to also say that the 6 times energy needed to convert electricity back to a gas and back to heat, this is based on electrolyzers today, but research is ongoing. People are developing new things, and I've seen some very promising information from the Netherlands, where they have wind turbines, wind integrated electrolyzers, which can produce hydrogen in a very efficient way. So what we see today is not yet the picture that we will have in 2050, also in terms of energy efficiency. I think this is where I can put it. Of course, we are not in the gas production sector, so I cannot give the exact perspectives of what it will be in 2050, but this is as far as I can go now.
Thank you, Vera. And now, Thomas, I'm going to ask you about heat recovery, also from cooling processes, because of course, when we talked about heat pumps so far on this webinar, we didn't really touch on heat recovery using waste heat, which is one of the areas where heat pumps can play a role. And maybe also in that context, you could maybe touch on large-scale industrial heat pumps, because we also had a question on that in the Q&A.
Yes, we are hearing often that cooling is becoming more important. And every time you operate a cooling device, you get heat for free. If you are in the European Parliament, you go to the 16th or 17th level, you look outside the windows left and right, you see a lot of cooling equipment on office buildings, on this office building specifically. And this office building also has a number of quite big gas boilers in the basement for hot water generation. And here, that's what I really mean. The big change needs to happen in our heads. If somebody had thought, oh, this cooling device, which is running 24/7, is actually producing waste heat, and instead of producing thermal waste to the city, we just connect this waste heat with the heat demand in the basement for hot water demand, you could have saved investment, and you would have been much more energy efficient. So energy efficiency first starts there. When we talk about industrial applications, we did a short assessment with one of our members who said, okay, we have 60 gigawatts of cooling equipment installed in Europe. This is real, right? These are real machines. They are operating as we speak at 3,000 hours per year. This is also a number that comes from this assessment. And then they say, okay, you can assume that each megawatt of cooling capacity gives you about 1.2 megawatt of heating, of waste heat. So 60 gigawatts of cooling capacity gives you 72 gigawatts of heat, waste heat, that is then distributed to the environment or wasted. If you would declare waste heat as waste and it would have to fall under the waste legislation, you wouldn't be allowed to do this. Now you connect this and say, but all of these installations are in industrial facilities where most of the time there's also heat needed. Now you connect the waste heat with the heat recovery unit, add a heat pump and bring it back to the temperature level that you need. Then you can replace 15 billion cubic meters of gas. And 15 billion cubic meters is about 10% of the total import from Russia that we want to get rid of. So this would be really something, but it needs recognition by the Commission. It needs a mandate to talk about it, and it needs the obligation for the users, of course, to deploy these heat recovery units plus heat pumps. I think that should be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Now I have some quite technical questions. I assume both Werle and Thomas can probably answer them. Maybe Kalis, you can as well. And this is a question about if the temperature is below 65 degrees, there could be issues with Legionella disease. So there's a question how to deal with that if we lower the temperature to that extent, and are there ways of avoiding that? I assume both Werle and Thomas, you can answer. Kalis, if you want to chip in, please do. But I assume this is a kind of more engineering question for our two speakers from the heating industry. Thomas or Werle, any of you can answer that?
Go. It's easy actually.
There are there is thermal treatment. Could be done, for example, with an electrical heater that shortly heats up the tank and the piping, or there are other treatments as well, like chemical treatments, UV treatments, that serve the same purpose. So it doesn't always have to be thermal treatments to kill Legionella. I don't know if you want to add something to this, Thomas.
No, I think this would be the typical hybrid approach. Either you run the heat pump at 65, 70 degrees, which new refrigerants allow, or you have a thermal treatment with direct electric booster, and then you can also do it. And yeah, and then it's a long discussion, I think, that we don't want to open here.
Yes, and on my side, indeed, the most energy efficient solution will be the best. So it depends on the application. Obviously, if it's possible to pass UV rays through the circulation of water, that's one viable option already mentioned by Werle. Thanks.
There's one broad question again, which I think I want to put to Kalis and Thomas. And this comes back to a point that was made earlier about demand-side response. I mean, if we transition to a system where rather than combusting fuels, we use electricity, there is, of course, a strain on the energy system, or an opportunity, depending on how we use that new electric load that will be caused by heat pumps. So the question for Kalis is, what are you doing to make sure that member states are implementing what's in the electricity regulation and directive, where there's some really good elements that would enable more demand-side response, more aggregation or flexibility? And in question to Thomas, that was asked in the Q&A, how do we avoid that dumb heat pumps are being sold, off the shelf that are not grid interactive? How do we make sure that we build in that smartness into heat pumps that get installed? Kalis, do you want to go first? And then Thomas, you can comment specifically on the technology question.
Sure. I'd say the question boils down to the effectiveness of allowing the prosumers to operate. The door is open there at the EU level. So we have the Electricity Market Design Directive and the Renewable Energy Directive with their energy communities and renewable energy communities. The question often boils down to the actual implementation, and not many of the regional or national administrations have managed to translate and make the requirements sufficiently flexible. For example, we don't have many social housing or building owners registered as energy or power producers. But I think that's the logical next step to make a business case, to allow, first of all, for them to generate their own electricity. And then because of the fluctuations or, let's say, differences in the sinusoids of consumption and supply because of the intermittency of renewables, that there will definitely be room for offering the energy to someone, but then it has to be also remunerated based on some agreements or a condition that makes the business case, plus then additional requirements on the safety, security of supply, etc. And one important point there, of course, are, for example, data centers, the waste heat potential. You mentioned district heating, and there indeed is the potential to use the energy that's left over from cooling the data centers, or also tertiary buildings, to provide heat and energy to nearby buildings and to other consumers. But you probably know all of this already, so I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thomas, Klaus. The second part of the question was about smartness and make sure that's built in.
Maybe we need smart people to choose smart heat pumps, but that was just the humorous part. I think it has to become attractive. It has to become attractive, as Carlos said, by implementing the electricity market design directive, which is, again, as I said, not the case. So really, and this is overdue for now 18 months. So I think it's time to poke some people a little bit. And then in order not to only look at the Commission, what we can do is we can talk to utilities more. We can look at new business models. We can propose to end users that if they combine photovoltaic and a heat pump and maybe a battery and an electric charge point, if they make their buildings fully electric, then they will benefit because their own photovoltaic array is their own smart tariff. And then the heat pump needs to be able to talk to the inverter from the photovoltaic array to increase the self-consumption. And of course, that would also be true in multifamily buildings and in social houses and in commercial buildings and in hotels, etc. So there is something to be done about this type of solution in the new EPBD. There is this idea of energy communities. I heard this morning that the people that are most concerned with that are not super happy. So I think this idea of enabling local communities to produce and use energy more in their own little circle, that would be something that needs some more attention, to my understanding. But then I'm not an expert on this type of legislation.
Thank you, Thomas. I have one more question for Verla, but we're running out of time. So I want to make sure we finish on time because I'm sure you all have other meetings starting just a few minutes. Andreas, I will hand back to you to wrap up. And thanks for listening to the panel discussion. I look forward to interacting with many of you in the future. Andreas, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jan. And it's just upon me now to thank everyone who was part of this event today, from Nicola and Maxi, who have helped organize it, to our first speakers, Richard and Marie, and then, of course, Jan moderating the session with Thomas, Verla, and Carlos. Thank you so much. I think we had some interesting food for thoughts now for the legislation that the Commission has proposed, and we're very eager to see how the co-legislators decide in shaping the final legislation. And of course, as Richard mentioned, the fundamental discussion has changed now over the last months from the time we were initially writing the report, and everyone is now looking with great anticipation to the legislation or the proposals for communication and legislation that Carlos and his colleagues are going to be coming out with tomorrow with the Repower EU. So I think it's an exciting time now to see how much of what we talked about today in the panel and in the reports can be delivered. With that, I think I'm handing now back to Nicola to give a few final words of closing.
Well, mainly the goodbye advertising block towards the end. We're very good on time. Thanks everyone on the podium, and also to the audience